Hi, Brian Lehrer here. Up next, Brian Lehrer Weekend. 3 of our favorite segments from the week packaged together for you to listen to on the weekend. So enjoy, and I'll see you back on the radio Monday at 10 a.m. on WNYC and WNYC.org. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. We'll be doing segments about Passover and Easter and the world situation this week. Passover first, because it comes first. Good Friday is this Friday, and Easter is this Sunday. With respect to Passover, the New Yorker has a very thoughtful article this week about the divides within Jewish congregations, within Jewish families, as Passover approaches, over the way Israel is fighting its wars in Gaza and now Lebanon. What will the conversations be like around many families' Seder tables on a holiday that celebrates freedom from oppression, freedom of movement, and the founding of Israel, the Promised Land, as a refuge for the Jewish people? The article cites, for example, a Washington Post poll just a few months ago that found 46% of American Jews supporting the war in Gaza and 48% opposing it, basically a 50-50 split in the American Jewish community. And the article quotes from a sermon back on the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, last fall, by Angela Buchdahl, senior rabbi of the Central Synagogue in Manhattan. Now, I found a video of it, and I'm going to play the quote to help set this up. Play the clip. Then we'll talk to the writer, Eyal Press from The New Yorker, and take your calls about your families and your congregations. This runs a minute and a half. Again, it's Rabbi Angela Buchdahl and her Rosh Hashanah sermon at the Central Synagogue. Listen to both halves of this as she acknowledges different worshipers within her own congregation who might fire her as their rabbi if she says what she really thinks.
I want to tell you about my unconditional love for the Israeli people and our beleaguered homeland, still desperately struggling to bring its hostages home, still trying to eliminate Hamas, terrorists that not only refuse to lay down their arms but intentionally trap their own people in a combat zone. But if I tell you these things, all of which I believe, some of you will stop listening and decide that I'm no longer your rabbi. I also want to tell you how my heart breaks over the civilian deaths and tragic suffering in Gaza, the shattering destruction of Palestinian homes and cities. I want to denounce settler violence in the West Bank and the rhetoric from far-right government ministers who talk about annexation of the West Bank and expulsion of Gazans instead of ending this war and bringing our hostages home. But if I tell you these things, all of which I also believe, some of you will stop listening and decide that I'm no longer your rabbi. This Israel conversation is ripping our community apart, not just here at Central, but across the Jewish world, among friends, within families. It's been the most painful experience of my rabbinic life.
Angela Buchdahl, senior rabbi of the Central Synagogue in Manhattan, in her Rosh Hashanah sermon last fall. And with that, we welcome New Yorker magazine writer Eyal Press, who cited that sermon in his article called At Synagogues, Tensions Are Boiling Over. Disagreements about Gaza and Zionism have divided congregations. Eyal, thanks for coming on. Welcome to WNYC.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's great to be here.
And Jewish listeners, you're invited to call in and reflect on the tensions you may be experiencing in your congregations. Rabbis, congregation members, are you experiencing this kind of tension? If so, are you able to have productive conversations about it? Are you able to resolve it in any way? Is anyone changing anyone else's mind? Are any of you literally deciding that your rabbi is no longer your rabbi because of their positions on Israel or Gaza or Zionism today, one way or another? And if so, what then for you and for them? 212-433 WNYC 212-433-9692. Or maybe this is happening for you outside of a synagogue, elsewhere in your Jewish life, maybe in your family. We know there's a lot of this divide by generation, right? There's been a lot of talk about that, but not just by generation. One woman from Congregation Bethel in Maplewood, in the article, describes herself and her husband in this context. She says, "We're in a mixed marriage on Israeli politics." Does that sound like you and your spouse too? So again, if you're experiencing this kind of tension, are you able to have productive conversations about it within the family, with your husband or wife or parents or kids? Are you able to resolve it in any way? Is anyone changing anyone else's mind? What's the heart of the moral question or moral questions you're grappling with? 212-433-WNYC. Any Jewish Americans, rabbis, anyone else, 212-433-9692. Call or text. So, Ayal, let's start with that clip of Rabbi Angela Buchdahl. Did you report it out on Central Synagogue enough to know how divided that particular Manhattan congregation is on how Israel is conducting these wars?
No, I didn't. I have to say, I did reach out to Rabbi Buchdahl, and she declined a request for an interview. I think probably because she felt her sermon speaks for itself. But I did focus intensively, as you mentioned, on a synagogue in New Jersey called Congregation Bethel, located in South Orange. And I should say and emphasize that the division I found there is not unique to Congregation Bethel by any means. It's playing out across the Jewish community, as Rabbi Buchdahl's sermon suggested. And I wrote the article really with two sort of ideas in mind. One is that, so much attention had focused in the media on the protests after the Gaza war, the pro-Palestinian protests. And one of the striking facts about those protests, which sort of came out, here and there in the news coverage, is that there were Jews on college campuses who were deeply upset and offended by these protests. And there were also Jews on college campuses who were participating in those protests. That's not a secret, but it tells you something about sort of how divided and fractured the Jewish community was getting and has gotten. And the other reason I really wanted to delve into this is, the mistaken perception, and I think the dangerous perception, that Jews are a monolith, that they think in one, that they speak in one voice, that they all hold the same views when it comes to subjects like Israel and Zionism. That has never been true historically. It is less true today in the American Jewish community than perhaps ever before. And so we should be talking about it and understanding why.
I did read through your article, so much of which is about Congregation Bethel in the Maplewood, South Orange area. And I will say it took some time. If one were to print this article, I see it would print at 41 pages. And, well, for one thing, Rabbi Buchdahl didn't want to comment to you. Rabbi Buchdahl, maybe you're listening and want to call in and describe what the next steps would be after that sermon, right? Can you bring together factions of your congregation? Or maybe you've taken more of a stand on one side or another yourself. Rabbi Buchdahl, if you're listening, or any other rabbi, any other Jewish American. But on Congregation Bethel, the rabbi there, Jesse Olitsky, I think it's fair to say, based on my reading of your article, clearly took a side. And a congregation member, Nathaniel Felder, who you profile, who was protesting Israel the way it was conducting the war in Gaza, was very frustrated, even though the leadership was progressive on other things at that congregation, like ICE and immigration. So where would you start to tell the story of Congregation Bethel?
Yeah, I think that captures the background well. Rabbi Olitsky, with whom I spoke, is a very progressive guy on a lot of issues, on ICE, on civil rights. He's participated in an interfaith group in New Jersey that where folks work together on those issues. On the issue of Israel and Zionism, I think it's fair to say that after October 7th, his sense of attachment and feeling of the inclination to defend Israel and to worry about Israel and to highlight the plight of Israel intensified. And he's not alone in that. One of the sort of theses of the article is that there had been a kind of soft sort of liberal Zionism, a place where people who were slightly more conservative and slightly more liberal could meet and not necessarily argue. But that October 7th and the Gaza war has really shattered that. And you have one group that has felt a heightened attachment to Israel and a heightened sort of fear of anti-Semitism, a belief that it's worse now than it's ever been, and therefore, we need to stand with, quote unquote, our people. At the same time, you have a lot of Jews, and they're not just Jews in their 20s. They're parents, they're Jews in their 40s and 50s. They're people like Nat Felder, who were at first concerned initially, both by of course, they felt horror at the October 7th attack and sympathy for people in Israel they knew, but immediately felt concern for Israel's response, that it would be brutal, that it would be indiscriminate, that many innocent Palestinians would die and suffer. And those concerns escalated as the course of the war intensified. And Nat Felder, I opened the piece by describing the point he came to, and this was last spring when reports were surfacing that Israel was blocking humanitarian aid into Gaza. And Nat, who is someone who, has a lot of family in Israel, and his grandfather made Aliyah, left his home in Long Island, went to Beersheba, lived there for a year himself. All of this is in the piece, but he could not remain quiet when he would pass the sign in front of the synagogue that said, "We stand with Israel." And meanwhile, what he saw as a policy of starvation was unfolding, because that same grandfather taught him that the most important thing about being Judaism was adhering to certain basic moral precepts. And the most important of all was protecting human life. So he wrote to the rabbis, and he wrote to them several times, actually, asking that the sign come down or that some sort of congregation-wide email be sent. And when this didn't happen, he took matters into his own hand. He made a sign of his own, and the sign said, "Starvation is against Jewish values. Our support of Israel cannot be unconditional." And he made the sign, he stood in front of the synagogue, and that's sort of the point of departure for the piece and what unfolded and how things got to that point, not only at Bethel, but again, at a lot of other congregations.
And we'll come back to Congregation Bethel and some of what you describe they undertook there to try to hear various points of view from within the congregation, but if I'm reading your article correctly, it wasn't very satisfying to a lot of the people there. Here's an example. This is sort of maybe a meta example of how deep this divide runs. Even the fact, Ayal, that we're doing this segment, and I guess by extension that you published this article, that the New Yorker published this article right now. Listener wrote shortly before we went on the air, The Brian Lehrer Show, How Gaza and Zionism Are Dividing Synagogues. Great story idea, but right at the start of Passover, nasty mistake. And so even raising the topic and its relevance to this week starts to get some people ticked off.
Absolutely. It's not surprising at all. But if we'd done this in the fall, people would have said on the eve of the high holidays, how can you talk about this? And if it were neither holiday, they might say, how can you talk about this in a moment when anti-Semitism is rising? And I'd refer them to some of the voices in the piece. I quote Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove at one point, and he's a sort of controversial figure in the piece because he gave a very divisive sermon criticizing Zoran Mamdani. But in his in the quote I mentioned in the piece, he says, his biggest concern right now are the internal divisions within the American Jewish community. And so, you can pretend they're not there. You can pretend it's never a good time to talk about them, or you can talk about why they have formed. And, I have to say I was inspired and moved by the stories shared with me by the members of this congregation, who, as you rightly note, many of them are very frustrated and have been very frustrated because they're at a synagogue where they feel that their sense of belonging is harder to feel because their perspective on the war in Gaza and on many of these issues is not represented in the same way that the other side's is.
And we played that clip of Rabbi Buchdahl from Central Synagogue in Manhattan saying if she expresses one half of what she believes, some of her congregants will say, you're no longer my rabbi. And if she expresses another part of what she believes, other congregants will say, you're no longer my rabbi. Well, I think we have a call from somebody who literally did fire their rabbi and change congregations over some of this. Udi in Highland Park, you're on WNYC. Thank you so much for calling in. Hi.
Hi, thank you. My wife and I were members of a conservative synagogue for 20 years, and we resigned after our rabbi gave a sermon about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and talking about how the shrieks of the people coming from the destroyed cities were the shrieks of the perpetrators, not the shrieks of victims. And this was early on into the Gaza war, when there were just 15,000 people who had been killed. And I went up to him afterwards and asked, is that what am I taking away from this what I think I am? And he said, yeah. And he brushed away any concern about the humanity of the other side. And we resigned after 20 years of being members.
Do I understand correctly from my screener that you and your wife served in the Israeli Defense Forces?
Yes, we both grew up. We grew up in Los Angeles, moved to New Jersey, and we both served in the IDF.
That's intense. Are you in contact with people back there and having conversations with them? So much of the Israeli public, from the polls I've seen of there, supports pretty much everything that the Netanyahu government is doing in Gaza and now Lebanon. Do you still have relationships there with people you're in dialogue with?
Yes, we have family there. But I don't bring up the political situation because even those who oppose Netanyahu, my cousins in Israel have marched against Netanyahu, but I think they're firmly in favor of what Israel is doing against Gaza. And I listen to Israeli radio, and you just hear that there's a very biased view. It's all about the hostages and the victims, and there's nothing on Israeli radio, on Israeli media, about the other side and what they're suffering.
Udi, thank you for your call and your perspective. Let's go right to another caller. Matt in Brooklyn says he's a rabbi, and this kind of divide is central to his existence now. Matt, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi. I told your screener that the phrase I usually use, and people have seemed to come around to it, is the definition of politics is that if you disagree with me, it's called politics, and if you agree with me, it's called Jewish values. And I don't only say it actually to be funny. I think it's actually a really valuable or hopefully meaningful way of looking at the issue, because if as a rabbi I were to say to my congregants, "Oh, I just got back from the J Street conference," then they're going to say, "Why are you so involved in politics?" But if a colleague says, "Oh, I just got back from the AIPAC conference," nobody's going to say, "Why are you so involved in politics?" There are just certain things.
Because JPAC is a progressive group, AIPAC is AIPAC.
Yeah, J Street,
so
yeah.
Depends, right? What the reaction will be.
And in that
Go
case,
ahead.
Even further, even people who actually probably do disagree with AIPAC, for example, will still not even see it as politics, because we've come to see it as this kind of, I guess you could say it's an Overton window type of thing, where we've come to see that as just sort of a normal part of Jewish communal life, whereas the other one is quote unquote political because so many people so vocally disagree with it. Yeah. Anyway, I wish I had.
Well, how do you navigate this divide as a rabbi in your congregation? Do you try to move toward some kind of consensus or some kind of, I don't know what the word is, maybe tolerance or respect for those with the other point of view than some of their co-congregants?
Well, I'd like to think I act with tolerance and respect toward all of them. I think it's to the point of your piece. I mean, I'm in a much more traditional kind of synagogue than Rabbi Buchdahl. So if I were to, for example, speak about keeping kosher, the importance of keeping kosher, the importance of keeping Shabbat, and then I found out that a congregant doesn't keep kosher or doesn't keep Shabbat, I don't think anyone would think, oh, I bet he doesn't respect them. I bet I'm not going to feel welcome there. I hate him for saying this thing that disagrees with me, whatever it is. But when it comes to this issue, people say, well, how come you're saying things that I disagree with? And it really is, and not just this issue, I guess politics in general really are this thing where how dare you say this, how dare you have this position that isn't the same as my position, whereas on seemingly all other matters of Jewish life, that's okay.
Matt, we really appreciate your call, Rabbi. Thank you very much. And as this in Pesach to you. Stephen in Westchester, I think, is calling about a congregation where there's another type of approach to this that actually comes up in Isles New Yorker article. So, Stephen, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for taking the call. I was going to say that I think some of the, at least my congregation feels a little bit stymied because it's I feel like if the rabbi were to bring it up, I think they would sort of lose memberships because I think some of the congregants are so entrenched in this bit of like a blind faith approach to Israel and what they're doing, and it's very interesting because it's the same people that would criticize what's going on in this country in terms of the government, but they don't really seem to criticize what's going on there.
One thing you told our screener, and I want to see if I got it right, is that your congregation doesn't really talk about Israel because they don't want to divide themselves among themselves, and the rabbi doesn't want to lose one group or another. How much are you experiencing that? Is that an accurate characterization?
I would say Israel in terms of like what's going on there with Gaza and the West Bank and Palestinians. I mean, when I was going to Hebrew school, it was very much of like we can, two-state solution. But, I mean, I feel like the two-state solution hasn't been a real concept in, like, 25 years. So maybe it should say 20 years, but...
Stephen, thank you very much.
A take on it.
Stephen, thank you. Well, that kind of touches on something in the article, Al, that you wrote about, which is that a lot of rabbis, according to your reporting, will just avoid the topic. They'll talk about other Jewish issues, but they'll avoid Gaza and now Lebanon because they don't want to divide the congregation. Is that what you found?
I think that's definitely one impulse. I think it's a reason that as the Gaza war got longer and longer and bloodier and more divisive within the Jewish community, there were a lot of rabbis who just strained to avoid it. But there's another factor at play in that, and that is that saying anything critical or perceived to be critical, by a board member or a donor to the synagogue or a member of the synagogue, is dangerous. You can be branded a traitor if you do that, particularly if you're a younger rabbi. And I heard in my reporting that younger rabbis who are more inclined to have more progressive views on this issue are the ones who are most afraid to speak out. I did speak with Rabbi Sharon Brous, the senior rabbi at a synagogue in Los Angeles, and she talked about the discourse. She called this discourse "defend, deflect, and denounce." So if you dare to say anything about Israel and you're a rabbi, the folks who attack you they'll defend Israel regardless of what it's doing. Then they'll say, "Why are you talking about Israel? Why aren't you talking about Sudan?" And then they'll denounce you as someone who's disloyal to your people. And she has been denounced in that way several times. So I think there's a great disincentive to say anything critical. At the same time, and you heard it in these calls, and I think it's a more general thing. American Jews, by and large, are liberal. They pray to, what one scholar called, the God of social justice, a God who believes in equality and tolerance. And love for Israel in the United States, which I think peaked in the 1970s and in the decades afterwards, was sort of predicated on this notion that Israel was a country that sought peace with its neighbors, that integrated women into its army, that could sort of be wedded to that progressive ideology. Well, Israel yesterday passed a law, its Knesset passed a law mandating hanging for West Bank Palestinians who will be tried in military courts. That's not consistent with progressivism. What's happening in the West Bank is not consistent with progressivism. And so the tension that I described in this article is not going to go away, and in fact will very likely intensify in the years to come, particularly among younger people.
Here are two texts that just came in that kind of reflect pieces of the divide. One says, Passover is when Jews are supposed to reflect on how bitter it is to be oppressed and how important it is to struggle for freedom. It's the perfect time to talk about the plight of Palestinians in Gaza, a people held captive, starved, many of whom are refugees from their land that they were driven from within living memory. But a very different text says, I am a Jew in my 40s. I used to define myself as a moderate Zionist. After the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7, 2023, and during the subsequent war, I have become a more radical Zionist. I am also an advocate of freedom of speech and diversity of opinion. In that sense, I'm willing to tolerate the views and expressions of views of Jews which are different from mine. What I do not have patience for is when people who have opinions that are strong but uninformed. The mainstream media is not a good source of information regarding Israel, this person writes, citing New York Times, CNN, etc. People who rely on these sources to inform them about what is going on over there and then think and speak as if they are well informed do so in error. So a couple of texts that came in back to back that exemplifies what's in IL Press's New Yorker magazine article. After the break, we'll play a clip from a journalist guest who was on the show last week from Lebanon, who raised a specific moral issue facing Israel and its supporters, and we'll continue to invite your calls from your point of view, maybe specifically on that clip. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we continue with New Yorker magazine writer A.L. Press and his article with Passover beginning tomorrow night. And we're going to have a Easter and Good Friday and the world situation segment later in the week. A.L.'s article is called At Synagogues, Tensions Are Boiling Over. And here's one source of those tensions. Last week, we had journalist William Christou of The Guardian on from Lebanon, where Israel is hitting what are widely considered civilian targets because Hezbollah uses that same infrastructure as civilian non-combatant Lebanese people do, as Hezbollah plans and stages attacks on Israel from across the border. The reporter gave this example.
What we're seeing in those areas, there's a widespread targeting of medics, including through the use of double tap strikes, which is when they strike somewhere, wait for paramedics to come, and then they strike the area again, hitting the paramedics in the process. And what we saw in the last war, what we saw in Gaza, is that the point of this is to make it increasingly difficult for people to stay in those areas, to clear those areas out so that Israel can fight their war easier. And human rights groups have warned against this, saying that, it amounts to forced displacement.
So Jewish listeners, on that human rights group's argument as one side of it, and Israel's argument on the other side of it, that without destroying that much civilian infrastructure, even killing people in the healthcare workforce, as we just heard there, without doing that, Hezbollah will be able to keep attacking. So it's the right of self-defense. So Jewish listeners, as we discuss these divides among American Jews as we head toward Passover tomorrow night, in the context of Jewish community divides like the Washington Post poll that we mentioned at the top that found basically a 50-50 split among American Jews on whether they support the war in Gaza. What's your own answer to these moral questions? How much killing of civilians is justifiable in the context of trying to protect your community from a military foe that is real and that is attacking you from within that community? And on the Zionism question, which we'll get to in a little more depth with our guest, how much is national self-determination justifiable, even when your group has indigenous roots there and they were persecuted for 2,000 years everywhere else they've been, if you're setting up a country without equal rights? Or any related question you want to address and that maybe you'll bring up at your Passover Seder this week. 212-433, WNYC, call or text 212-433-9692 to the theme of Ayal's article. And Ayal, you're right that even Zionism is now being perceived differently in the Jewish community with, more of a divide. And so, for example, you give us some history, citing a broad unity among American Jews about Israel after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, surprise attack by Arab countries. Most American Jews weren't Zionists in the sense that they wanted to move to Israel, you say, but they were glad that it existed overwhelmingly. Why do you cite that particular Arab-Israeli war as having been so galvanizing, and what do you compare it to today?
Well, I think it's just such a striking contrast with October 7th. So the Yom Kippur War, the surprise assault launched by Arab forces on the Jewish holiday, the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, stirs this pretty unified response in the American Jewish community that, I quote the commentary editor Norman Budhoritz, who didn't need any convincing, but he celebrates the fact that this attack has, as he says, converted, all American Jews have been converted to Zionism. Even the skeptical Orthodox Jews who thought that Zionism was a heresy were coming around. He quotes Irving Howe, the editor of Dissent, a socialist who, expressed distaste for nationalism, but admitted that he felt this astonishingly intense, feeling for Israel when the Yom Kippur War broke out. Then you fast forward 50 years to October 7th, and it's another surprise attack that sort of punctures this era of invulnerability, I should say, in Israel. Would it galvanize the same unity? To the contrary. What it has galvanized is what it has done is sharpen the divisions, create deeper polarization, make Israel and Zionism more contentious subjects within the Jewish community. And that's in part because the American Jewish community has changed. It's also because Israel has changed. And so, I think that contrast is really striking.
And again, some texts coming in that are on various sides of this. If they don't want to be attacked, they should stop attacking Israel. Very simply stated. We're getting a few like that. I think in contrast to those, Helene in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hello, Helene.
Hi. This is just so pressing for me. I am a baby boomer, the essential baby boomer, born in 1946. To two parents who escaped from the Holocaust in 1939, from my father from Poland, my mother from Vienna, and leaving behind very, very many relatives, tens of which died. At the same time, I grew up in Brooklyn in a very progressive family. And what the Passover Seder means to me right now is talking about how to be a Jew in light of both prevalent anti-Semitism and what Jews are doing, Israelis are doing in the Gaza, destroying people. That's not the Jew that I was brought up to be. Humanism was, in fact, the core of our ideals. What I was most proud of is that my parents did not bring us up as Holocaust Jews. They brought us up with optimism in our place in the world, and we worked for all kinds of progressive things. But it's an unmixed feeling. I feel vulnerable as a Jew. I understand that the Israelis feel vulnerable. But at the same time, I don't support what the Israelis have done during this war in Gaza, and also have been much more informed in my later years about what the Jews did to take over the land of Israel and how much destruction and death and extrusion occurred. So none of this is an easy resolution, but certainly I don't take offense that the New Yorker article was written at this time. I can't think of a more important time for Jews and everybody to sit and talk about what is it that we want? What can we accomplish? Who are we? Those are the most important questions.
Helene, what would you say then if you were in dialogue with the listener who just wrote this text? Listener wrote, I find the fact that the majority of Israelis, even those who were previously very sympathetic and supportive of Palestinians' rights, support the government actions. I find that persuasive in my support of Israel's actions. I don't believe that Israelis are uniquely irrational or immoral. Quite the contrary. It's easy for us to tut-tut when we sit in our safe bubble, quite different to feel the need to protect those who have brutally mutilated our innocent loved ones. What would you say to that listener?
I understand what came to mind as you were saying it. It's like asking the victim of or the survivor of an attack. Okay, my child is killed. You're asking me, should I put the perpetrator of that horrendous crime to death? These are not the people. I understand this is a country in fear. They've been attacked many times. They've had thousands of their soldiers die. This is not really where you can draw back and say, okay, who do I want to be in light of this? What am I willing to do to the end? I understand the fear. That's why I premised my comments with I don't have, that absolute solution. There is anti-Semitism. The Arabs have attacked Israel multiple times, but the Jews have done incredible things to take over the land of someone else and to push them out. And they have now conducted a war in a way that's killing many more than the people who are hurting them. So I wish I had a magic answer. Right. I don't think there's a magic answer. But I don't know that the fear of the Israelis is necessarily the answer to what we want to do, because it goes beyond the war. What do we do with Israel going forward? It's a democratic nation. It could never be.
Thank you very much for your call. We really appreciate it, as well as to the listener who texted the words that we contrasted her with and invited her to respond to. Eyal, as we head toward the end of the segment, I'm going to read one more text, which it appears came from a member of Congregation Bethel at Maplewood, which is, where the heart of your article is. Listener writes, I am a white Jewish woman in my late 60s and a member of the congregation reported on in Eyal's article. I appreciate that a core aspect of our Jewish tradition is to wrestle and grapple with hard things. We are about the dialogue and the exchange and the learning, and we remain in community with one another, even when we don't agree with one another. After all, we are all and remain co-congregants, and that's something to be celebrated and amplified. So I guess my closing question to you, based on your deeply reported article, is where is this headed or might head going forward? Or are people like our various callers and texters from various points of view, destined to divide into political echo chambers like the country is doing to such a degree within the Jewish community in the United States?
Well, it's a great question. I'm going to defer to Liba Bayer, one of the people I interviewed in the piece. She grew up in a super Zionist household. She is now openly identified as anti-Zionist. She is also a member of Congregation Bethel. And one thing she mentioned to me, which I later saw, was that Congregation Bethel is a big tent synagogue, meaning this is a movement that sought to open the doors of synagogues to LGBTQ Jews, to interfaith couples, really to broaden who feels accepted. And what she said to me was, for me and for a lot of young people today, big tent means diversity and tolerance, the tolerance of diverse views on Israel and Zionism. I think that actually pinpoints the challenge for rabbis. Can you be tolerant, not just through paying empty lip service or occasionally saying, sure, we'll welcome you in, just don't expect any of your views to ever be articulated from the Bima or in congregation-wide emails, but can you really be an equal part of this community, expressing your beliefs in dialogue with others, and not be tagged as disloyal or un-Jewish or somehow hostile to the congregation? I think that's a challenge, and the challenge will grow because as younger Jews grow up and become members or look for congregations, they have experienced these events, these formative, deeply, they have watched the Gaza war unfold, and they don't remember the Yom Kippur War. They don't remember 1948 as well as they remember 2000, the October 7th attack, 2023, and its aftermath, the destruction of Gaza. So if there is no big tent in these communities, then it will be polarized and they will split up. I think that's the really hard challenge that faces these institutions.
New Yorker writer, A.L. Press. He's also author of the book, Dirty Work, Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America, which came out a few years ago and won some journalism awards. Thanks so much for joining us on your latest article.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian, and happy Passover to the listeners.
This week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, the United States, Ukraine, and Russia, and now throw Iran into the mix.
Iran has played such a huge role in enabling Russia's war against Ukraine. So now, when Iran is under attack, Russia is reportedly sending drones to Iran to help them out.
I'll talk with Ukrainian journalist Olga Rudyenko on the New Yorker Radio Hour from WNYC. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. On Tuesday's show, the day before Passover, we talked about how divided American Jews are over how Israel is conducting the wars in Lebanon and Gaza. For example, a recent Washington Post poll found basically a 50-50 split among American Jews on Gaza, and we cited several local synagogues mentioned in a New Yorker article where the congregations are clearly and sometimes emotionally divided. Well, it's also Easter week, and in Christian America, there are deep divisions too, and probably on no issue more than immigration and the mass deportation campaign right now. Here's one example. Last year, while Pope Francis was still alive, he specifically criticized the Trump administration's immigration crackdown in a papal letter that he released. And Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, also citing his Catholicism, pushed back. The audio on this 30-second clip is not great, but I think you'll get it.
Look at how it's worse for the Pope. Pope wants to fix the Catholic Church. I'm saying this as a lifelong Catholic. I was baptized Catholic. I was First Communion as a Catholic. Confirmation as a Catholic. You ought to fix the Catholic Church and concentrate on his work and leave border enforcement to us. He wants to attack us from securing our border. He's got a wall around the Vatican, does he not? So he's got a wall around to protect his people and himself, but we can't have a wall around the United States. So I wish he'd stick to the Catholic Church and fix that and leave border enforcement to us.
Border czar Tom Homan putting his Catholicism up against the Pope's in what he himself in that clip called harsh words for the Pope. So with Good Friday and Easter upon us, now we ask, how can Christians, citing Christian values, be so politically divided if they're all asking themselves some version of the question, what would Jesus do? We'll play a J.D. Vance clip that addresses the question from his point of view coming up. And Christian listeners, how would you answer this question for yourself? How can Christians, citing Christian values, be so politically divided if they're all asking themselves, what would Jesus do? about immigration and other political issues where there are deep divides right now. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. You can call or you can text. And with us now with his take and his Christian practice is Lutheran minister Reverend Juan Carlos Ruiz, pastor at Good Shepherd Church in Bay Ridge, known for actively ministering to immigrants, including those not in the country legally, among others. Pastor Ruiz, thanks for your time on what I know is often the busiest week of the year in your profession. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be here.
Would you start by talking about yourself and your own immigration and spiritual journeys a little bit? I see you were born in Mexico. Was it to an observant Lutheran or other Christian family?
No, I was brought up Catholic for most of my life. I became an ordained priest in the Catholic Church here in the States. I came to the States because as an unaccompanied minor, and my family was here out of status, so I came to join them, and I joined the flow of undocumented immigrants here in the country back in the 1980s, late 1980s. So that has really marked the trajectory of my life and ministry. And that really spills out in terms of the praxis that I have as a Christian witness and as a Christian leader.
Unaccompanied minor, you said you were still a teenager when you came to the United States to reunite with other members of your family, right?
Yes, my whole family was here undocumented at that point in the 1980s. So I became also undocumented after I joined them, and ever since I've been here on this side of on the border.
What made you and them want to live in this country?
Well, basically, we were kind of forced out because of the economic downturn in the 80s. Back in the day, the peso was devalued. My father, who had, often come and go, the border has always been porous for us Mexicans, and we just kind of jump back and forth. And my father came in the 1980s because we had borrowed money in dollars, and we woke up one day, owning millions of pesos instead of the 200,000 pesos we had borrowed, because of the currency depreciation back then. Kind of forced us to look for a better place. And my father, who knew the routes, he came across the border. He was a peasant. He's a peasant. Great man, great worker. So he came and work to pull us through. We are 6 siblings in the family, and my mother.
You just used the words porous border. Most Americans, according to the polls, say they support immigration, but they don't support being here illegally and don't support a porous border when it's put in terms like those. So the border should be controlled tightly as we debate what our immigration rates should be. Do you disagree with that? And is it rooted in your Christianity in any way?
I do not disagree with controlling the border. We have to remember, the border has been militarized, over-militarized. Previous administrations. I think what we have seen nowadays is over-militarization of the border, and the policies of immigration against every sector of our lives has been weaponized against the most vulnerable in our communities. And that doesn't include not only includes immigrants, but the LGBTQ plus community and other minority groups that are being kind of with this almost unbalanced, tilted enforcement policies that we have in place, that has really bulldozed people, that has really sent us back and deteriorated, the civil rights that we had acquired via, the movements, the civil rights movement in our city. I think part of this immigration, over policing is really sending us back and deteriorating the democratic values of our society.
What made you want to become a minister?
Because I thought and I think I could contribute to my people and to the people of this country. I mean, this is a nation of immigrants. With all respect to the indigenous people of this country, but this is a nation also of immigrants, and I want to contribute to this society. I also know, because of the prophetic tradition that I have been fed and grown into, I think the power of this country has to bend to the needs of the people, and especially to those who are most vulnerable among us. And that's what we celebrate nowadays. We begin this Holy Triduum, which is the Passover for us, by Jesus, radically, in kind of changing the roles. Here is the master, here is the healer, bending down and washing the feet of the disciples and taking the role of a slave, practically. And to teach us that it is via humility is how we work and how we do the work as we engage the powers of the world.
And listeners, with Reverend Juan Carlos Ruiz, pastor at Good Shepherd Church in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, we are inviting your calls on the question, how can Christians citing Christian values be so politically divided? If they're all asking themselves, what would Jesus do? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text. And Kathy in Ossining, you're on WNYC. Hi, Kathy.
Hi. In terms of what would Jesus do, I look at his life and I also look at readings from the Bible. And two things stand out. And it was written that whatever you do to the least of my brothers, that you do unto me. And I think that speaks to what's happening to immigrants who are not murderers or drug dealers, just normal people who are poor and are hungry. And we're taught to feed the hungry and help the poor. And secondly, Jesus walked with the lepers, people who were condemned to a valley because of their illness. Well, he walked with those people. And back in the day when there was so much hatred towards people who had AIDS, that's what led me to understand that people get sick for all kinds of reasons. And for his time, Jesus walked with those people. Mm-hmm. So, to me, how can you say, what would Jesus do? He's already shown us what he's done and what he believes.
What would you say to the Tom Holman clip we played, and we're about to play a J.D. Vance clip, both of them citing their Catholicism in the context of having very different politics than it sounds like you have? How do you understand it all coming under the same Catholic umbrella?
Well, I would tell them to go to the Bible that Catholics read. And
well, they're Catholics.
I think that's right. And, in a letter I forget who it was to. It was from Matthew, citing the Lord saying, "Whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers, that you do unto me." And
it's Matthew 25. Yes.
And that's in our scripture.
Kathy, thank you very much. Let me leave it there and get to some other folks and that J.D. Vance clip. We have another listener, Pastor, citing Matthew 25 in a text. Listener writes, as a Christian, I believe in Matthew 25, 34 to 47. If you are not feeding the hungry, you are not going to heaven. And that listener cites Trump ordering a shipment of food from USAID to be canceled. Caring for the sick, I think continuing on Matthew 25, decreasing Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, comfort the imprisoned. So there's a relevant passage that several people are citing. Let me play this clip of Vice President J.D. Vance, also a strong believer in Catholicism. He says he converted to it, and obviously quite politically different from you and our first caller, Pastor. You will hear in this clip how he argues that the political left gets one of Jesus' teachings backwards.
But there's this old school, and I think it's a very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your fellow citizens in your own country, and then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. A lot of the far left has completely inverted that. They seem to hate the citizens of their own country and care more about people outside their own borders. That is no way to run a society.
Pastor Ruiz, your reaction to that?
If you put 2 or 3 people in a room, you'll have 5 different opinions, And, but I think it's primary to see, that the value that Jesus places in the power of love, how you exercise that love and that praxis to protect the most vulnerable, to really create platforms and spaces and to really use that power for the well-being of the least. It will cover all bases, I have to remember, that there are people who don't think the way I do. But, the driving force in Jesus' life that took him to his death was the deep conviction and understanding that, he would rather take on the violence against him that continue to do the cycle, to continue to do that violence unto others. When Jesus was being presented to the governor at that time, Pilate, they said, there is a tradition. Do we liberate Barabbas today, or do we liberate Jesus? And Barabbas means son of the Father, the same that Jesus was proclaiming, that he was the Son of the Father. And people, were kind of brainwashed, manipulated by the high priest, and they basically said, ask for the liberation of Barabbas. And it's the same question that is asked of us today. How do we use power nowadays? The power that is given to us. And what is love for us? This love that takes us to take on the violence on our bodies, on our lives, to redeem and to work for the well-being of others. I think there is distortion of power, and we really have to be careful, because Christianity nowadays, there is this leaning of Christian nationalism, and that equates power with being superior and exercising that power to submit, to make less others, to sacrifice kind of the quality of life, safety. We need to remember that safety for Jesus is found in community, is found in the power of love and how that love transforms enemies, how that love transforms all relationships to ourselves and to the world. That's what's being righteous nowadays, to know our place. And that's why this Holy Triduum, this Passover, it begins with the washing of the feet of the, to the disciples. And now we continue to do that, the washing of feet of the most vulnerable among us, the ones that are barefoot because the shoes, their dignity is being taken away by, weaponizing policies that really do not help at the long run, but it's a waste of our resources and of our money.
I guess J.D. Vance was saying in that clip that mass immigration could be a threat to some communities that are already here, and the communities that are already here should be the first priority rather than the concern for people who are coming from elsewhere.
And if it was so, Brian, we have a balloon budget that is justifying the criminalization of immigrants, as you have seen. I have in my small church, like 20 families have been affected directly because, by complying with the law, they've been going to immigration, to the immigration court at 26 Federal Plaza. They've been taken in, and this is just by complying with the law, because there is this, kind of probation monitoring that you have to do as they apply for asylum. And they've been doing, what the law tells them. And they go in and they are taken in illegally because they are complying. And, and not only that, Brian, we have to remember we have about 20% of our families in the nation that have a kind of a mixed status here in this country, which points to the need of humane immigration reform. It's been long. Many of our communities have been living in the shadows for 20 years, 30 years. There is no legal remedy. There is no line anymore because there is such a backlog of cases. And when you weaponize the courts, when you weaponize justice against people who are seeking to be protected, we gotta remember, there is a message that is being carried out into our home countries, that this is a place where you can enjoy some freedom, that you can live in dignity. This is the kind of the backside or the backhanded message that is being, passed on over and over. That's a credit to who we are as a country. But we have weaponized that lately. And this has happened in previous administrations. I think what our president is doing is evidencing a system that is really rooted in an injustice and that victimizes those who are seeking refuge and protection from the complicity of our government in our own government's home countries that have created conditions that have displaced massive amounts of people.
Tom in Manhattan, I think, wants to pick up on something that you just said in that last answer, Pastor. Tom, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Yes, hello. Thank you. I don't need to speak for what would Jesus do. I think the pastor has done a wonderful job in citing a real Christian attitude, especially toward immigration. But what I want to point out is that Christian nationalism is not Christianity. That J.D. Vance, when he misquotes Aquinas, and that particular quote, was condemned by the Pope after Vance said it, the one that you played. Those people, they're not Christian. Christian nationalism is a heresy. It creates an idol which it worships, which is power, and it does not listen to the teachings of Jesus. It totally forgets about them. If it can pick and choose in the Old Testament to find places where people have wars and fight each other, and Psalms where people talk about their shields and their swords, but the heart of Christianity is the teachings of Jesus, and that is the teachings of peace and care for the poor and for justice, and it has nothing to do with what the Christian nationalists are going around shouting.
Tom, thank you very much. Viola in Kew Gardens, you're on WNYC. Hello, Viola.
Hello. Tom said it perfectly, and I thought he was going to take it that one step further so that I wouldn't have to say what I was going to say, which is Christianity is about supporting all of humanity. You don't turn people into enemies, much like in Judaism, where you're supposed to welcome the stranger. So in Matthew 26, 50, verse 52, when Jesus says, those who live by the sword die by the sword, he told that to one of his disciples. So if Jesus is going to call out one of his disciples and say, put the sword down, Peter, this is not what we do, I don't see how we can misconstrue that as being pro-war, which is what Christian nationalism does. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's go right to John in Park Slope. You're on WNYC. Hi, John.
Hey, hi. Happy Passover to you and your family. I wanted to just bring out the fact that in the Triduum and also the 3 days, the 3 holy days of Christianity, of Catholicism in particular, I know Catholicism because I'm a Catholic, and also of Jewish descent. And Passover, that a lot of Catholics or a lot of Christians don't know the Old Testament that well. And I just wanted to tell your audience, although I think everybody covered this before that with great, insight, that Jesus was a Jew, and he mentioned that, the stranger should be welcomed because we were once strangers in the land of Egypt. So this is a very important concept for, all our people to understand. And I just wanted to bridge, the two important dates in our calendar, and bring that to the forefront.
Thank you.
And everybody who mentioned that, the pastor said Matthew 25, absolutely true. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you, John. Tying together Christian and Jewish teaching relevant to Passover as well as Easter. And here's a text that brings Islam into it. Similarly, listener writes, finding this conversation so interesting, we have this concept in Islam when giving zakat. We begin with the nearest circle of influence. This is relating to the J.D. Vance clip where he said you're supposed to care for your community first. We begin with the nearest circle of influence, showing care by giving to those in need. And the priority of who we should give to is defined by similar circles of influence, familial, then community, then global. The question to me, writes this listener, is what kind of care and love that Vance is assuming people should show to these circles. The circles of influence matter because of possible impact for improvement, not because we seek to exclude others and hoard for ourselves. So interesting, that caller and that texter relating Jewish concepts and Islamic concepts to what we've been talking about regarding Christianity. Pastor, tell us about your congregation in Bay Ridge. Who are your congregants generally, demographically speaking, and how do you minister specifically to immigrants, including those who are undocumented in this climate?
Well, it has been really unsettling, to say the least, and really tragic for many of our families, given the, fear has been politicized and weaponized as I said before, about 20% of our families are mixed status. Uh, Many of them, given that some of their brothers and sisters have disappeared, are really very much living on edge, really stressed out. It has affected the attendance in our community. We have a great deal, the majority is a Latinx community coming from all over the global south, from Venezuela to Colombia to Mexico. We live next to Sunset Park, just a few blocks away. So we get a lot of the spill of people who have been here living in the shadows for 20, 30 years, and they haven't seen any attempt to regularize their status by the politicians. That's what I said. I think this president has evidence as an really unjust system that blames those who are already being persecuted and exploited in our midst. I think for us as a church, the lesson from us from the pandemic, is how do we become our neighbors? How do we become neighbors to our neighbors? And how do we become a church that is, really deeply entrenched in the prophetic teachings of Jesus? The hallmark is radical hospitality. And so these days for us is remembering those liberation stories that many of our community members have experienced in their own lives, and remembering so that we can be remembered into one body, into the unity of this body here on earth. And now that our bodies, our psyches, our souls are really at risk, given the dehumanizing forces that we are facing, I think we take heart with this story of the Passover of liberation. But we are reminded that, we are not free until everybody is free. And that's what Jesus came, and that's what the movement of Jesus has, he began over 2,000 years ago. And I think we are trying to be in solidarity and in part of this movement for peace and justice. And nowadays, where the sounds and the noise of war seems to be stronger, we Christians believe that the humble gestures of service of that is seeking the justice that has been denied for many of our people, that can be really break open new ways of understanding and relating to one another. And it begins by being, highly localized, but it doesn't stop there. I think love has that quality of transcending walls, transcending communities, and really making us one in unity, despite having diverse opinions. Despite I think the quality of love has the power to unite us.
On the diverse opinions, one more text. Listener writes, I've always seen religion and scripture as a Rorschach test. You bring to it your values and can find interpretations that support them. Do you agree with that? And if so, what does religion even mean?
Religion has a lot to do to reconnect. It's supposed to reconnect ourselves to our divine origins, but by doing so, this is a human journey. So, like at least in my view, religion really brings out the best in us, but it can be used for misuse and weaponized. I remember this men that used to come to my church and had this leather-bound Bible that was so worn out. And the cover of the Bible, only the words that kind of were vanishing rapidly. It used to say TNT, the New Testament. But it was just because of the tear. And I said, well, that is explosive, And we have seen that happening, in El Salvador back in the 80s. The Bibles were being banned because they said that it fed this mentality of revolution, of overthrowing the dictatorship back then. And I think it can be really explosive. That's why we need to really be careful and have in mind and in our hearts that the driving force for Jesus and Jesus followers is, first of all, love and a non-violent love and a praxis that really teaches us mercy at the heart of it. And that mercy moves us to compassion, and that compassion moves us with the power of love to forgiveness and to really commit ourselves to make of our world, of our corner of our world, a better place.
Reverend Juan Carlos Ruiz, pastor at Good Shepherd Church in Bay Ridge. Again, thank you for giving us some time on what I know is so often the busiest time, the busiest week of the year for people who are, pastors and priests. So thank you very much for this, and happy Easter to you and your entire flock.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks for listening to Brian Lehrer Weekend. We're back on the radio Monday morning at 10 a.m. In the meantime, follow us on Blue Sky at The Brian Lehrer Show, where there's always a conversation 24/7.